Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Patriot's History of the United States. I'm the co-author of Patriot's History, Larry Swikart, your host here for this reading. I'm reading through Patriot's History of the United States, the 15th anniversary edition. If you have an earlier edition, some of the pages won't line up. You have a much earlier edition, some of the headers might not line up. Also remind you that sometime in the spring, I will have available a 20th anniversary edition in PDF only. It'll be free. It'll include one full chapter from 2018 to 2023, probably 10 to 20 pages of additional and inserted material. I will say on page 110, after such and such a paragraph, insert this. A lot of new stuff, a lot of interesting stuff. And again, that will be free on the website sometime after the new book, Patriot's History of Globalism, comes out on February 20th. Remember, I'm trying to turn Patriot's History into a movie. Go to the site, look for the Buy Larry a Coffee button. I need your help. Buy me a coffee. If everybody did that, all the followers on Twitter, we'd be able to finance the whole movie. So just help me out and buy me a coffee. All right. We've been looking at Chapter 6, the Perils and Promise of Jackson's America. We've been looking at internal improvements, the tariff, the Webster-Hayne debate last time, and this time we're going to take on the Bank of the United States, or BUS. Now realize this is the second BUS. Hold on, I'm going to sneeze. I did have to sneeze. This is the second BUS. Remember that the first had been, the charter had been allowed to lapse in 1812, and in order to finance our way out of the War of 1812 and handle some of those war debts, Congress created a second BUS in 1816 with a 20-year charter, meaning it will expire under Jackson in his second term. And many people wanted to take advantage of that, as we will see. But before I start reading, I just want to remind you of how banking worked back then, because it was so different than what we have today. You had state banks. That's what they're called. It's a bad name because they're private banks. They're not owned or controlled by the state. The reason they're called state banks is because they got their charter or their right to do business from a state. Those banks could issue money. They printed and issued their own currency, including a famous $3 bill. It wasn't phony. You then had private banks. These were merchants or factors, as they were called in the South, who would make loans to individuals and kept their own account books. They could not print money, but they could go wherever they wanted. And we have records of these people branching into other states. State banks could not branch unless the state charter, say Bank of the State of Tennessee, allowed you to branch, which it did. Okay, so we have state banks, we have private banks. And then we're going to have the Bank of the United States, which, like its predecessor, is 4/5 privately owned, but can branch anywhere and can print its own money. So, one last thing. Remember, for a bank to operate and print money, that money had to be backed up by gold or silver coin called specie, usually in the form of British, Spanish, or US gold dollars or American silver dollars or half dollars. And the ratio normally was 15-1, meaning 15 ounces of silver to one gold coin and 15 notes to 15 ounces of silver, or an ounce of silver was equal to a note, a banknote, usually. And so if people were afraid a bank was weak or in trouble, they would hurry down to the bank to cash in their notes and get gold or silver, hard money, okay? It was thought that the Bank of the United States would facilitate commerce by having branches in many states, So you weren't that far away from a branch of the Bank of the United States. And B, the BUS could print its own notes, which were standardized. So you had a type of standard money around the country. So whereas previously merchants going, say, from South Carolina to Ohio or from Tennessee to New York would carry gold or silver, which is hard, it's heavy. It's hard to make denominations to break it down, get change for it. They would take along BUS notes, which were accepted almost anywhere. Now, the Bank of South Carolina, pretty good bank, but its notes might not be accepted in Ohio or New York, but BUS notes were. All right. With that in mind, let's get started. And we are starting on page 226, Jackson's War on the BUS. Having deflated the Nationalist Republicans' programs on internal improvements and tariffs, there remained only one plank of their platform to be dismantled, the Second Bank of the United States. Traditional interpretations held that the small government-oriented Jackson saw the BUS as a creature in the grip of moneyed elites who favored business interests over the common man. A hard money man, so the story goes, that is somebody who always favored gold and silver over paper money. Jackson sought to eliminate all paper money and put the country on a gold standard. Having a government-sponsored central bank, he supposedly thought was both unconstitutional and undesirable. At least that was generally accepted story for almost a century by American historians. Nicholas Biddle had run the bank expertly for several years, having replaced Langdon Cheves as president in 1823. A Philadelphian, Biddle had served as secretary to the U.S. Minister to France, edited papers, and helped prepare the documents detailing the Lewis and Clark expedition's history, and briefly served in the Pennsylvania State Senate. Biddle's worldliness and savoir-faire immediately branded him as one of the noxious elites Jackson fretted about. But he intuitively knew banking and finance, even if he had little practical experience. He appreciated the BUS's advantage over state chartered banks and used them, yet all the while cultivating a good relationship with local commercial banks. What made Biddle dangerous, though, was not his capabilities as a bank president, but his political powers of patronage in a large institution with branches in many states, all with the power to lend. In other words, Biddle's BUS was almost like a post office, but with the ability to lend money. Only the post office and the military services among all the federal agencies could match Biddle's base of spoils. Biddle also indirectly controlled the votes of thousands through favorable loans, generous terms, and easy access to cash. Whether Biddle actually engaged in politics in such manner is irrelevant. His mere capability to do so threatened a man like Jackson, who saw Eastern cabals behind every closed door. Thus, the bank war was never about the BUS's abuse of its central banking powers or its supposed offense against state banks, which overwhelmingly supported rechartering the BUS in 1832. So this is another one. Oh, the people opposed the BUS. No, the state bankers, the people in all these tiny towns, small towns, all favored the BUS because it made their job easier. Rather, to Jackson, the bank constituted a political threat that must be dealt with. Jackson sided with the hard money faction and had strongly resisted both the chartering of state banks and the placement of the BUS branch in his state. But that was in the early 1820s on the heels of the panic. His views moderated somewhat, especially when it came to the idea of a central bank. Jackson's hatred of a central bank is exaggerated. Like Thomas Hart Benton, William Gouge, and Thomas Ritchie of the Richmond Enquirer, Democrats and Jackson supporters had reputations as hard money men. Jackson himself once heaped scorn on paper money he called rags emitted from banks. Still, a decade's worth of prosperity had an impact on Jackson's views, for by 1829, when he started to consider eliminating the BUS, he asked his confidant, Amos Kendall, to draft a substitute plan for a national bank. So this blows all this notion that Jackson was out to destroy the monster because, he's a populist and the national bank is this big institution. He was already planning his own national bank. It just was that it was going to be in the hands of Democrats, not his political opponents. Few historians deal with this proposal. Jackson's best biographer, Robert Remini, dedicates approximately 1 page to it, but he misses the critical implications. Other noted writers all but ignore the draft message. The president did not intend to eliminate central banking entirely, but to replace one central bank with another in a continuation of the spoils system. Why was the current BUS corrupt? Because in Jackson's view, it was in the hands of the wrong people. As governor, he had not hesitated to write letters of recommendation to staff the Nashville branch of the BUS using the same arguments, quote, that the right people would purge the system of corruption. The existing BUS was corrupt in Jackson's view, only partly because it was a bank. What was more important was its heritage as the bank of the panic and the bank of the elites. Given the intensity in which pro-Jackson authors cling to the anti-bank Andrew Jackson, let the reader judge. According to his close associate James Hamilton, Jackson had in mind a national money. His proposed bank would afford, quote, a uniform circulating medium. That's not gold or silver. And he promised to support any bank that would, quote, answer the purposes of a safe depository, the public treasurer, and furnish a means of ready transmission, unquote. He was even more specific, according to Hamilton, because the 1829 plan would establish a new, quote, national bank chartered upon the principle of the checks and balances of our federal government, with a branch in each state and capital apportioned agreeably to representation, a national bank, entirely national bank of deposit is all we ought to have, quote unquote, emphasis in the original. Was the same man who had proposed a national bank with interstate branches capable of furnishing the ready transmission of national treasure also eager to eliminate state banks? It seems unlikely, given his supposed affinity for the rights of states to exercise their sovereignty. Nothing in the U.S. Constitution prohibited a bank or any other business, for that matter, from issuing or circulating notes. However, based on Jackson's willingness to crush state sovereignty in the Indian removal and his repudiation of South Carolina's nullification, it is clear that to Andrew Jackson, the concept of states' rights meant that what Andrew Jackson wanted it to mean. More disturbing, perhaps, and more indicative of his true goals was a series of measures introduced by the Democrats to limit the country to a hard money currency. Again, historians concentrated on the hard money aspect of the bills, while missing the broader strategy, which involved a massive transfer of state power to the federal government. Jackson's forces in the Congress began their assault seeking to eliminate small bills, or what were called change bills, which in and of themselves testified to the shocking shortage of small coin needed for change. In other words, just the fact you had to have small bills meant that there wasn't many nickels or dimes or pennies circulating. Prohibition of small notes constituted the first step in the elimination of all paper money to these zealots and would have moved the control of the money supply from the market forces to the federal central bank, such as Jackson proposed. So again, it's nonsense that he's trying to have market forces involved here. His goal is to move banking out of the control of market forces. Whatever his final intentions, Jackson needed to eliminate the BUS as both an institutional rival to whatever he had planned and as a source of political patronage for his foes. Between 1829, when he'd asked Kendall to draft his own plan, and 1833, Jackson and his allies attempted to work out a compromise on the existing BUS recharter effort. They outlined 4 major areas where the bank could alter its charter without damaging the institution. In fact, thanks to the advice of Clay and Webster, Biddle was assured that the BUS had enough support in Congress that a recharter would sail through without the compromises. Pro-bank forces introduced legislation in 1832 to charter the BUS 4 years ahead of its 1836 expiration, no doubt hoping to coordinate the effort with the presidential campaign of Henry Clay, who had already been nominated, whose choice of the National Republicans, soon to be Whig Party, to run against Jackson. The gauntlet had been thrown. Many bank supporters thought Jackson would not risk his presidential run by opposing such a popular institution, but Old Hickory saw it as an opportunity to once again tout his independence. In May 1832, typically personalizing the conflict, Jackson told Van Buren, quote, "The bank is trying to kill me, but I will kill it." When the BUS recharter passed in Congress, Jackson responded with a July veto. In his 8-year term, Jackson issued more vetoes than all previous presidents put together. But the bank veto in particular represented a monumental shift in power toward the executive. Other presidential vetoes had involved questions surrounding constitutionality of specific legislation, with the president serving as a circuit breaker between Congress and the Supreme Court. No longer. In a message written by Roger B. Taney of Maryland, Jackson invoked thin claims that the bank was, quote, unnecessary and improper. Of course, Marshall's court had already settled that issue a decade earlier. Jackson's main line of attack was to call the bank evil and announce that he intended to destroy it. Clay misjudged the appeal of Jackson's rhetoric, though, and printed thousands of copies of his veto message, which he circulated thinking it would produce a popular backlash. Instead, it enhanced Jackson's image as a commoner standing against the moneyed elites who seemingly backed the Kentuckian. Meaning Henry Clay. Jackson crushed Clay, taking just over 56% of the popular vote, 219 electoral votes to Clay's 49, but voter turnout dropped, especially in light of some of the earlier state elections. So this is an interesting development we have, that voter turnout starts to fall when you expand the electorate. When you start doing away with property requirements, turnout starts to drop. Why? Because people don't have as much at stake. They don't have property at stake, and so whoever's president isn't going to mean as much to them. Upon winning, Andrew Jackson withdrew all federal deposits from the BUS, removing its main advantage over private competitors. That is, by having hundreds of millions of dollars of government money, the BUS had more money to lend out than any private bank anywhere. Without deposits, the bank had nothing to lend. Jackson then placed the deposits in several banks whose officials had supported Jackson, then placed the deposits, had supported Jackson. And while not all were Democrats, most were. He opposed banks as long as they were not working for his party. This is the important thing here, folks. The BUS war was about moving control of a national bank to the Democrats, not getting rid of a national bank. He was not hostile to a national bank. He said so. He planned his own national bank. All he wanted to do was get rid of the BUS as a political opponent, or a potential political opponent. These pet banks further revealed the hypocrisy of Jackson's anti-bank stance. He opposed banks as long as they were not working for as long as they were not working for his party. Jackson's disdain for the law finally met with resistance. His own Secretary of the Treasury, Lewis McLean, who had endorsed Jackson in his war, now realized the dangerous constitutional waters in which the administration sailed. When Jackson instructed him to carry out the transfer of deposits, McLean refused, and Jackson sacked him. The president then named William J. Duane to the post, which required senatorial approval by custom, though not according to the Constitution. Jackson ignored congressional consent, then instructed Duane to remove the deposits. Duane, too, viewed the act as unconstitutional and refused. Out went Duane, replaced by Jackson loyalist Robert B. Taney. Taney, who complied with Old Hickory's wishes, although Jackson had finally persuaded Congress to pass the Deposit Act of 1836, giving the actions a cloak of legitimacy. As a reward, Taney later appointed Chief Justice of the United States was appointed Chief Justice of the United States. All in all, the entire bank war was a stunning display of the abuse of power by the chief executive and demonstrated a willingness by the president to flout the Constitution and Convention in order to get his way. At the same time, it reaffirmed the adage that the American people usually get what they deserve, and occasionally allow those who govern to bend, twist, or even trample certain constitutional principles to attain a goal. What happened next was misunderstood for more than a century. Biddle called in loans, hoping to turn up the heat on Jackson by making him appear to be the enemy of the nation's economy. A financial panic set in, followed by rapid inflation that many observers then and for some time had come to lay at the feet of the bank war. Without the BUS to restrain the printing of banknotes, so the theory went, private banks churned out currency to fill the void left by Biddle's bank. A new type of institution, the Wildcat Bank, also made its first appearance. Wildcat banks were in fact free banks or private banks, organized by state general incorporation statutes, that is, incorporation laws, not by a charter of the state legislature. To relieve the burden on state legislatures from having to pass special statutes, chartering ordinances to allow banks to open. In modern times, virtually no businesses need special legislation from government to operate, but the free bank and general incorporation laws had only just appeared in the 1830s. Supposedly, the Wildcat banks printed up far more money than they had specie in the vault, but established branches, quote, where a wildcat wouldn't go. So they made it nearly impossible to establish branches, quote, where a wildcat wouldn't go, and made it nearly impossible to redeem the notes. In other words, they're setting up these branches in such remote areas that no one can actually take their money in and exchange it for specie. So the theory is that these Wildcat banks printed up all sorts of extra notes because they weren't restrained by either the BUS or by the hard money standards. In other words, banks printed unbacked currency. Again, the theory held that without the BUS to control them, the banks issued money willy-nilly, causing massive inflation. Much of the inflation, it was thought, moved westward to purchase land, driving up land prices. By the end of Jackson's second term, rising land prices had become, in his view, a crisis, and he moved to stem the tide by passing the Specie Circular of 1836, which required that all public land purchases be done with gold or silver. Attributing the rising prices to speculation, Jackson naturally was pleased when the boom abruptly halted. Economists Peter Timmon and Richard Timberlake, among others, found that for more than a century, this consistent explanation of what happened after Jackson killed the BUS remained universally accepted. The tale had no internal conflicts, and the technology did not exist to disprove it. But after the availability of computing tools, economists like Timmon could analyze vast quantities of data and gold and silver movements, and they came to startlingly different conclusion about Jackson's war. It meant little. What happened was that large supplies of Mexican silver had come into the country in the late 1820s over the newly opened Santa Fe Trail, causing the inflation or the increasing prices, and the silver flowed into the trade network, financing porcelain and tea exchanges with China, and ending up in England after the Chinese bought British goods. So the money really is going all the way around the world, from Mexico through our banking and commercial system all the way to China to pay for porcelain, silk, and other stuff, then to England. And then when it got to England, the British in turn lent it back to American entrepreneurs. But in the early 1830s, with the Texas Revolt, the Mexican silver dried up, and so did the flow of silver around the world that finally found its way into English banks. So this money flow dried up starting in Mexico. It dried up in American merchants. It dried up in China. It dried up in England. With the silver reserve disappearing, the Bank of England raised interest rates, which spun the U.S. economy into a depression. So when Britain raised its interest rates, that started the Panic of 1837. Timmon proved the BUS did not have the size or scope of operations to affect the American economy that historians have previously thought. No matter how petty and ill-conceived Jackson's attack on the bank was, he must be absolved of actually causing much direct harm to industrial growth, although new research suggests his redistribution of the surplus probably contributed to the damage to financial markets. On the other hand, whatever benefits his supporters thought they gained by killing the monster, the bank, were imagined. Okay, there's one more short section in this chapter. We'll get to that next time, but we're going to pick up with the reading of Jackson's veto message. Pick up the reading of that message itself in the Patriots History Reader next time. So I will see you guys back here on Wednesday.